The bed frame creaked so loud, I stopped breathing entirely. My little sister was sleeping 15 feet away through a wall so thin you could hear her turn over in her sleep. My parents were directly below us in their bedroom, and I could picture exactly where my mother was lying and exactly what she was thinking because I knew that woman the way you only know someone, after 19 years of living inside the same small house with them. And I was lying in total darkness next to a man I had married 9 hours earlier, biting down into the pillow so hard my jaw ached because something was happening to my body that I had no name for, no preparation for, and absolutely no way to understand or process or place inside any framework I had ever been given. I was 19 years old. I had never in my life seen a diagram of a woman's body. I had never heard the word intimacy spoken out loud in any room I had ever been in. I had never had a conversation about desire or anatomy, or what happens between two people when the community and the church and all the watching eyes finally look away. The only reference point I had for what was happening in that bed on that night was what I had seen watching the cattle on our farm over the years. That was the sum total of my preparation for becoming a wife. That was my wedding night. My name is Sarah. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. One of 9 children raised on a dairy farm where the work started before sunrise every single day of the year without exception. Prayer cap from the time I was old enough to sit still. No electricity in the house. Horse and buggy for every journey. Church on hard wooden benches, every other Sunday in whatever barn or home had been cleared out to hold the congregation that week. I left the community a few years ago, after a leaving that cost me more than I knew I was capable of losing. And today I am telling you what really happens when an Amish girl becomes a wife. Not the version softened into something people can receive comfortably. The actual version. The one I lived inside and carried with me for years before I found the words for it. Here is what people outside the Amish world almost never fully understand, even when they think they do. In that community, sex education does not exist in any form. I do not mean it is limited or awkwardly delivered or handled with insufficient detail. I mean the topic is completely and deliberately erased from every space a young person occupies. Our schooling ends at 8th grade, and there is no health class in any Amish school. There is no biology chapter about human reproduction. There is no school nurse you could approach quietly with a question. The Ordnung, which is the living, breathing, unwritten code that governs every detail of Amish life, from the precise shape of a man's hat brim to the style permitted for a buggy, treats the human body as something inherently dangerous. To speak about physical desire is hochmut, pride, worldliness, a gravitational pull towards sin. You are taught from the time you are old enough to absorb teaching that God designed marriage, and that God will guide you when the time comes. That is the complete instruction. There is no appendix and there are no follow-up questions permitted, because asking follow-up questions would itself be a demonstration that you had been thinking about the subject, and thinking about the subject was already halfway to sinning. But God does not whisper instructions on your wedding night. I want you to understand that clearly. He does not appear in that dark room with a lamp and a gentle explanation. He leaves you there with your ignorance and your fear, and a man who is just as ignorant and just as afraid, and the two of you are left to figure out something that the entire structure of your upbringing has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure neither of you knows anything real about. Josiah courted me for 14 months. We used the bundling tradition, which is the old practice where a young man comes to your bedroom late on Saturday nights after the family has gone to sleep and you lie together on the bed fully clothed, talking in whispers while the house is dark and quiet around you. The idea behind bundling is that two people can get to know each other deeply and honestly in a private space without physical intimacy getting in the way of building something real. There is supposed to be a purity to it, a focus on the person rather than the body. We would lie there under the same quilt and talk for hours about everything that mattered to us, about faith and doubt and the futures we were trying to imagine for ourselves, about our families and our fears, and the small particular things that made us who we were. I came to know Josiah during those nights in ways I had never known another person before. His voice in the dark, the way he laughed quietly so the sound would not carry, the particular way he held his thoughts before he said something he was not sure about. We held hands under the quilt during those visits. The feeling of his fingers intertwined with mine in the darkness felt enormous, like something I should probably confess. Once near the end of those 14 months, he kissed my forehead, and the warmth of it spread through my whole body so fast I genuinely thought for a moment that I was coming down with a fever. That was everything, a hand and a forehead across an entire courtship. That was the physical totality of what we shared before we stood in front of 300 people and promised each other our lives. 3 weeks before the wedding, my married sister pulled me behind the clothesline, on a cold October afternoon where the sheets were snapping in the wind loud enough to cover our voices. She grabbed my arm with both hands and looked at me with an expression I did not have a word for at the time. Something between urgency and guilt, and a sadness she was trying to push past quickly, before it stopped her from saying what she had come to say. "It will hurt the first time," she whispered. "Just breathe. It gets better." I asked her what she meant by hurt, and where and how much, and what I was supposed to do, and she turned the color of the beets we pickled every fall, and said, "You will understand when it happens." Then she let go of my arm, and walked back toward the house, and that was the end of that conversation. 13 words. That was my sex education from my own sister, who had been married for 3 years, and had delivered 2 babies, and had been living as a wife longer than I had been engaged. The night before my wedding, my mother came and sat on the edge of my bed. I had been lying awake already for an hour in the dark when I heard her footsteps in the hall. She sat down, and for a moment she just sat there, and I could feel her trying to organize what she had come to say. Then she said it in one careful sequence. "Your husband will know what to do. Your job is to be willing and patient. This is God's design for children. Do not be afraid." She leaned forward and kissed my forehead the same way she had kissed it 10,000 times through my childhood, and she stood up and she left the room and closed the door behind her. I lay awake until the sky outside started to go gray, listening to the farm night around me, and trying to build a picture of what was coming from the fragments I had been given. I could not build a picture. There were not enough pieces. The wedding day was brutal in the particular way Amish wedding days are brutal, which is a brutality built entirely from duration and expectation, rather than from anything unkind. Up before 4 in the morning, because milking does not stop for weddings, and neither does feeding, and neither does any of the work that makes a farm function. My new dark blue dress that my mother had been sewing in secret for weeks. The fabric was the finest she had chosen for any dress she had ever made. Me and I understood without her saying so that this was a form of love she could not say with words. Over 300 guests arrived by buggy through the morning, filling the farm with the sound of horses and voices and the particular hum of a large Amish gathering that I had known my whole life, but had never before been at the center of. Our cleaned-out barn had been set up with the long wooden benches, and the bishop preached for 3.5 hours about submission and duty and the sacred weight of the promises being made in that room. I sat on the hard bench and listened and thought about everything except what he was saying, because thinking about what he was saying led me directly to the place I was trying not to think about yet. No rings, because jewelry is forbidden. No kiss at the altar, because public affection is not the Amish way. Just the vows spoken quietly in Pennsylvania Dutch in front of everyone I had ever known, and then the meal that followed, and the hours of serving and the cleanup that stretched until dark. And by the time the last buggy finally pulled out of our lane, my feet were so swollen, I could feel my pulse in my toes, and my head had been aching for hours, and underneath all of it ran the cold river of dread that had been running since I woke up that morning, and that I had not been able to dam up no matter how busy I kept my hands. My mother squeezed my hand once as she turned toward her bedroom. Just one squeeze and no words, and then she was gone down the hall and I was standing at the bottom of the stairs. This is where part 1 ends and part 2 begins. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand on the railing that my grandfather had built, the wood worn smooth from decades of hands doing exactly what my hand was doing now. The spare room at the end of the hall. The room my grandmother had died in 2 years before, and which still felt to me like a room that held things you could not quite see. Fresh sheets had been put on the bed. Her quilt was folded at the foot. Blue and white stars on a navy background that I had seen my entire life in that house, and that I associated with her smell and her particular way of moving through a room. A wash basin on the dresser. One kerosene lamp on the nightstand, throwing its shaking orange light up the walls and across the ceiling and making everything look like something from a long time ago. I changed into my nightgown, long white cotton with a high neck and long sleeves that reached to my wrists, and a hem that fell to my ankles, the same style I had worn every night since I was old enough to dress myself. Nothing had been done to make this nightgown different from any other. Nothing had been purchased or made or chosen to mark the occasion. I sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed my shaking hands together between my knees, and I sat very still and I waited. Josiah came in about 10 minutes later wearing plain cotton pajamas. He closed the door behind him carefully, the way you close a door when you are trying not to make a sound. And then he stood there for a moment, and in the lamplight I could see his face, and something shifted inside me when I looked at it. He was terrified. This man who could frame a house in a week and shoe a horse and deliver a breech calf at 2 in the morning, and who had always seemed to me to be someone who knew what to do in difficult situations, looked in that moment exactly like a boy who had wandered somewhere he did not know how to be. His jaw was tight, his hands were not quite still at his sides. He walked to the bed and sat down beside me. The mattress dipped under his weight. The bed frame made a small sound. Neither of us spoke. I do not know how long we sat there in that silence. Long enough that the lamp flame shivered once and steadied again. And then he reached over and took my hand. His palm was slick with sweat against mine, and he leaned close and whispered something that I have carried with me every day since that night. He said, "I do not really know what we are supposed to do." I nearly laughed. Not from humor exactly, but from the physical release of relief, because he did not know. The man the bishop had stood before 300 people and implied would know what to do was sitting in the dark, as completely lost as I was. Two people who between them had been running a dairy farm since childhood, and who could do a dozen things that would look impossible to people who had not grown up doing them, were sitting helpless in a bedroom, because 300 years of a tradition had looked at the most fundamental human experience and decided that ignorance was a virtue, and called it purity. He reached over and blew out the lamp. The darkness that fell was the complete darkness of a house without electricity. There is no darkness like it anywhere in the modern world. You cannot see your own hand. You cannot see the wall 2 feet away. You are simply in the dark, and the dark is total. I heard his breathing change, shorter and faster than normal. I heard the frame creak as he shifted toward me. His hand found my shoulder through the cotton of my nightgown, and I flinched. Not from pain, from the pure foreignness of being touched with intention. Nobody had ever placed their hand on me quite like that before. With purpose. With the clear understanding that this contact was leading somewhere neither of us knew how to reach. What happened next I will describe honestly, because honest is the only way to describe it. It was fumbling, and it was awkward, and it was brief. He tried what he believed was correct based on watching animals on the farm, because that was the only model either of us had. He shifted my nightgown. I was not ready in any sense of that word. Not physically, and not emotionally, and not in any of the ways a body needs to be ready before that moment. Neither of us knew that readiness was something that had to be cultivated. Neither of us knew that a woman's body requires time and tenderness and preparation before anything else. Nobody had told him. Nobody had told me that I was allowed to need those things, or that those things even existed as needs that had names. He thought closeness was sufficient. I thought willingness was sufficient. We were both wrong, and we were both completely without any way of knowing we were wrong, because wrong and right had never been taught to us in this particular territory. There were rules for everything in our world. Rules for the width of a hat brim, and the length of a dress, and the precise degree to which a buggy could be modified. But no rules for this. No guidance. Nothing. It hurt, sharp and burning in a way I had not been warned about, clearly enough for the warning to mean anything when it arrived. I bit down into the pillow and kept my sound inside, because my sister was 15 feet away through that cardboard wall, and some instinct deeper than thought told me to be silent. He whispered that he was sorry, and I could hear in his voice that the apology was real and that it cost him something to say it. But he did not stop, and I did not ask him to stop, because in the world I had been raised in, stopping was not a concept that applied to this. This was God's design. You did not interrupt God's design. You received it. You endured it. If enduring was what it required, you were willing and patient, because that was what you had been told your job was. 2 minutes, perhaps 3, and then he rolled away from me, and lay breathing hard in the dark, and the silence came back into the room louder than anything that had preceded it. I lay still on my side of the bed. Tears were running sideways into the pillow. Not from cruelty, because Josiah had not been cruel. He was one of the genuinely kind people I have known in my life, and there was nothing in what had happened that came from unkindness. The tears came from a confusion so deep and so total that it felt like a kind of grief. I had expected something to change in that moment, some door to open inside me, some feeling to arrive that would explain why the Bible described marriage as 2 people becoming one flesh, some revelation that would make the discomfort and the fear and the months of anticipation resolve into something that made sense. Instead, I lay there feeling exactly as I had before it began, except sore and bewildered, and more alone than I had ever been in my life while lying 6 inches away from another person. He fell asleep. I lay awake for hours in the complete dark, listening to the sounds of the farm at night, wood contracting in the cold, horses shifting weight in the barn, the particular silence of a place that is full of sleeping life. I pressed my hands flat against my stomach and I prayed. I asked God to help me understand. I asked him to help me be a good wife. I asked him to tell me what I was supposed to do with everything I was feeling and not feeling. I do not know if he answered. I fell asleep eventually without knowing whether he did. This is where part 2 ends and part 3 begins. The morning came the way mornings always came on that farm, before the light was fully in the sky. Chores do not pause for a wedding night any more than they pause for anything else. I rose in the gray pre-dawn and dressed and went down to the barn, and by the time the sun cleared the tree line at the edge of the field, I was already an hour into the day's work. The neighbor women who had stayed to help with the cleanup from the day before moved around me with soft, careful smiles, and I smiled back, and nobody said anything about anything except the practical things, and life resumed as though nothing had happened except that I was a wife now, and that changed how people spoke to me and how they looked at me, but did not change anything else that I could find. It did not get better. I want to say that clearly because I know people want the story to turn somewhere towards something warmer, and the truth is that it did not turn that way. Not for weeks, not for months. Our intimate life settled into a pattern during those early months of marriage that never substantially changed from what that first night had established. Always after the lamp was out, always brief, always purposeful, in only the narrowest possible sense of that word. He would reach for me under the quilt and shift my nightgown and begin, and I would lie there and I would breathe and I would think about the next day's tasks while he moved above me in the dark. I was not present in my body during those times. I had found a way to be somewhere adjacent to it, above it slightly, watching from a remove that made it manageable. I never experienced pleasure, not once during the entirety of that marriage. I did not know that pleasure was a thing that existed for women in this context. I genuinely did not know it was within the range of what was possible. I thought my role was to be still and willing, and that being still and willing was what a good wife was, and that a good wife was what I was supposed to be, and so that was what I was. You cannot reach for something whose existence you have never been told about. My friend Mary whispered to me once over a quilting frame. The other women were at the other end of the table, and we had perhaps 2 minutes of genuine privacy, and she used them to ask me if it was always so fast for me too. I said I thought so. She nodded slowly and we went back to our work, and that was the most honest conversation about intimacy that 2 married Amish women managed to have during the entire duration of my marriage. 7 words each, 14 words total, to cover a territory that deserved years of honest conversation. 4 months after the wedding, I was pregnant. The community celebrated, and I felt a relief so enormous and so immediate when the pregnancy was confirmed that it made me dizzy for a moment. Because now I understood what all of it had been for. A baby. God's blessing arriving exactly on the schedule everyone had anticipated. I took every confused sleepless night from those 4 months, and every tear that had gone into the pillow, and every prayer I had sent up into the dark asking for understanding, and I gathered all of it, and I pressed it down into a place deep inside me, and I put a lid on it. Motherhood was enough. Motherhood had to be enough. I needed it to be enough. After I left the community, and after the shunning fell, and after my family stopped returning my letters, and my name began to be spoken in my parents' house in a certain careful way that indicated I had become someone to be grieved rather than someone to be talked to, I eventually found myself in a therapist's office in a city I had never imagined living in. She was a small woman with reading glasses on a chain, and she did not look at me the way people sometimes looked at me when they found out I was formerly Amish. She looked at me like I was just a person sitting in a chair who needed help, and that unremarkable treatment was itself something I needed time to adjust to. During one of our early sessions, she said some words I had never heard spoken in any context during 22 years of living inside the Amish world. Consent, arousal, anatomy. She said them simply as though they were just words, which of course they are, but to me they landed like objects dropped from a height. Then she showed me a simple medical diagram, a page from a textbook. Nothing clinical or cold about the way she presented it, just a page. I sat there and looked at it and I cried for a long time. I was a grown woman. I had been a wife. I had carried and delivered a child. And I was sitting in a chair in a therapist's office, learning for the first time the names of parts of my own body. Learning that there were parts of my body whose entire purpose, the only purpose they serve, is sensation and pleasure. And that this purpose is not sinful or shameful or a trap designed to pull you away from God, but simply the way a body works. The way my body had always worked. Even when no one had told me it worked that way. I was not angry when I cried. People expect anger when I tell this part, and I understand why they expect it, but anger was not the primary feeling. Anger came later, in smaller doses, and at specific things. What I felt in that office was sadness. a devastatingly specific sadness for the 19-year-old girl who bit down into a pillow in a dark room and thought that was simply the way things were. For Josiah, who was a good man trapped in the same ignorance I was trapped in, and who wanted to be a good husband and was never given a single tool to work with, and never given permission to go looking for one. We failed each other in that bedroom on that first night and on every subsequent night. We failed each other completely and continuously, and neither of us knew we were failing because neither of us had ever been given anything to fail against.